Welcome back, gamers. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Nerd Space Games. Guys, I want to say thank you so much for tuning in on so many different episodes and videos of mine. It really means a lot, guys. And actually, the video today is actually inspired by one of you guys, and that is Paul Girdlestone. About 10 days ago, I posted a video about the hardest Resident Evil bosses in the series, and he actually came up with a good idea that I didn't even think of, and he said I should do a video that is on the easiest boss fights in the series. That being said, this video was a lot more difficult to make than I thought it was going to be, because let me tell you, there are some really extremely easy bosses, but trying to remember how my first encounter with those boss fights were, because obviously I'm a veteran of the series now, is actually pretty difficult. I don't know how to remember exactly how my first experience was. So I did my best diving back down into my memories, trying to remember which boss fights did I feel like were truly easy, truly the easiest boss fights of this series. And this list could be completely wrong. This is just completely my opinion and from my memory as to what was the easiest encounters in the series. Also, side note, I am focusing on the mainline entries. That includes every single numbered entry, the remakes, and Code Veronica, since that game was technically considered a mainline entry. But with all of that out of the way, guys, let's jump straight into the top 10 easiest boss fights in Resident Evil. Let's get it. Number 10, the Tyrant in both the remake and the original Resident Evil. Wow, this seriously breaks my heart to actually say that the first ever final boss I ever beat in any game is probably one of the easiest boss fights. I mean, seriously, your first encounter with the Tyrant is in the laboratory under the Spencer Mansion, and all he really does, despite his intimidating figure, is walk slowly towards the player, and I mean extremely slowly, until he gets close enough to actually land a hit on you. If you run to the other side of the room and you just keep shooting your most powerful gun that you have available on him, guess what? He'll be dead before he even gets a chance to actually reach you. Now, we are going to combine both encounters with the Tyrant from this game, since technically it's like a part 1 and part 2 of this boss fight. But even if we include that helipad fight, first off, that fight is completely avoidable if you just let the rest of the STARS members die. You monster if you've ever done that. But the second thing to keep in mind is that even that encounter is not all that difficult. Sure, he can now run and move a lot quicker, but honestly, it doesn't take that much damage to actually put him down. And as long as you are careful and you keep moving and you pay attention to his attacks, it's not that hard to avoid him overall. So yeah, despite being the first final boss of the entire series, the guy is not all that difficult, and it breaks my heart to say that he has a spot on the easiest bosses of Resident Evil. What? Number 9, Lisa Trevor, Resident Evil, the remake. Jeez, I'm constantly taking jabs at one of my favorite video games of all time, but let's be real here. Resident Evil and its remake was not really known for the difficulty boss fights. No, it was mainly known for the environmental horror it created, the old school survival horror aspects, and the puzzle solving. However, when it comes down to the boss fights, none of them were really that difficult when you think about it. Maybe the Yawn or Plant 42, but the rest of them were kind of easy. So it doesn't really surprise me that the remake actually featured one of the most interesting and tragic characters, Lisa Trevor. However, the final boss fight with this character, of course, to be expected, is another easy boss fight. Basically, the whole goal of this fight is actually to run around to the different pillars and push them off the edge, so that way the coffin will open up and Lisa Trevor will grab a part of her mother and jump off the cliff. That is seriously all you have to do in this boss fight. Now, it is more difficult for sure than the rest of the boss fights that we're going to talk about later on, specifically because if you get too close to the edge and Lisa Trevor at the same time, she could actually instant kill you. And if you don't immediately notice the fact that you have to push the pillars off to actually defeat her faster, then you might actually go the long way and try to go guns blazing and keep shooting her until she gets close enough to the edge and falls off that way. However, for my first ever attempt through this game, I was actually able to defeat Lisa Trevor without receiving any damage from her at all. All I had to do was run to the opposite direction that she was at, push the pillar that's over in that location. By the time I finished pushing that pillar, she would jump or walk over towards me, and then I would move to the next farthest pillar away from her and push that one off, and continue that process and do repeat and repeat until all 4 pillars have been pushed off, therefore creating a fairly easy encounter with Lisa Trevor.
I have been such a good girl!
Number 8, Eveline, Resident Evil 8 Village, Shadows of Rose DLC. Eveline might be one of the most terrifying characters in the Resident Evil series. What she is not, though, is the most difficult boss in the series. As a matter of fact, we get a pretty good example of that in this Shadows of Rose DLC, where she takes her chance at taking down Rose. Unfortunately for her, we have a sidekick who literally tells us instructions on how to defeat her throughout the entire boss fight. Yeah, this boss encounter is actually the literal definition of hand-holding during a game, because you have someone literally telling you what to do in order to defeat her. And even if that character wasn't giving you instructions on how to defeat Eveline the entire time, it is still a fairly simple fight. All you have to do is hide whenever Eveline pops up, make sure you're facing the right direction and you are covered. She does her attacks, she's exhausted, and then you attack back. Rinse and repeat, as Eveline will appear in different parts of the map, and you continue that process until she is ultimately defeated. The only reason why I don't have this higher up on the list is because maybe, just maybe, her popping up in different locations might throw you off, and she might be able to take you down if you're not paying close attention to your surrounding. Other than that, she's not that difficult, and she is definitely one of the easiest bosses in the Resident Evil series, despite her horrifying presence every time she's on the screen. Number 7, Centurion, the Giant Centipede, Resident Evil 0. So one of the biggest complaints when it comes to Resident Evil 0 is the fact that the boss fights aren't all that difficult. And this includes that giant ass centipede that you fight next to the swimming pool. Mainly because this enemy actually spends all of its time just running around the battlefield and not even trying to attack the player. It literally spends all of its time just attacking Rebecca, who it has in its hands, and I guess is trying to slowly, very slowly kill her. And you play as Billy for this segment, and you have to just keep shooting or stabbing this centipede until it eventually dies and drops Rebecca. But like I mentioned, it just doesn't really do anything to attack. The only way it can actually cause you damage is if you get in its path of the direction that it's walking. And honestly, it's a very easy pattern to follow. Once you figure out the path that this centipede is going on, you can easily just dodge those movements and never take a single hit from the centipede. The only reason why I don't have it higher up on this list is due to the fact that it can actually take a lot of damage, and it takes a long time to finally put this thing down. To the point where a lot of people just decide to just take their time and just stab the hell out of it with the combat knife, because honestly, they don't want to waste all their ammunition on something that's not all that difficult. Also, I guess something that could make it a little bit more problematic for the first time you actually face off against this thing is that if you don't actually learn its pattern pretty quickly, you can get messed up, I guess, if you keep getting in its way.
You're still alive, huh? You better find me a clue before my friends murder you! TikTok! Your life song alive. Wait!
Number 6, Angie, Resident Evil 8 Village. Yeah, Village is not getting any love here, is it? Because this is the second entry for Resident Evil Village. But I want to start this off by saying that despite this boss fight not being difficult, it is actually one of the most interesting fights of the entire series that I actually really like. I was actually scared during this encounter, so I appreciate it for what it is. But basically, this boss fight is a glorified hide and seek game. That's all it is. All you have to do is look for Angie 3 different times, and she's hiding somewhere in the manor, and you have to look around this house 3 different times and find her in time. And as long as you find her in time, you're good. You defeat her. It's just as simple as that. So why don't I have this at like number 1 since it's pretty much a hide and seek game? Well, you actually have a limited amount of time to actually find Angie, and honestly, you can probably get lost if it's your first time exploring this house to its fullest. And not to mention, you just got done escaping from the baby monster down in the basement. Your anxiety's a little high, and now you have to go up against a possessed doll and her minions. Yeah, it's not the experience that you're ready for. So I definitely think it's an easy boss, just nowhere near the top. Number 5, G. Birkin, the final form in Scenario B of Resident Evil 2, the original and the remake. Wow, that was a mouthful, but you know what? We finally approach Resident Evil 2 as we're going to take a look at one of the bosses that I find extremely easy, and that is our boy Birkin. Now I want to point out that almost every single encounter with Birkin is somewhat difficult in its own right. However, I think the final form is the first time we actually come across Birkin where he actually doesn't really pose that much of a threat, especially if you actually were extremely resourceful with your ammunition. As long as you have a decent amount of ammunition, you can take this guy down pretty easily. Basically, in Birkin's final form, he takes up just about an entire train cart and he slowly moves closer and closer to the player. All the player has to do is keep shooting him, keep dealing damage, and eventually his eye will pop out. When that eye pops out, you need to do damage to, you guessed it, the eye, the obvious weak spot on Birkin. Keep doing this and you eventually defeat Birkin with no problem at all. The only reason why I don't actually have this higher up on the list has to deal with the fact that I feel like this encounter could be somewhat difficult if you manage not to be smart with your resources. It's very possible you could have ended up all the way to this final boss fight with very little ammunition, and that's a problem because it would force you to actually take your knife and go straight in Birkin's face and use your knife to actually defeat him, which is not ideal because in this situation, if you try to use your knife against Birkin, well, he has a instant kill attack. So if you find yourself using all of your ammunition on G3 Birkin or Super Tyrant or G4 Birkin, depending on which character you played as, then yeah, I can see it being a little bit more difficult than it actually really is.
Doesn't want to be my daddy? Then he can die.
Number 4, Eveline, Resident Evil 7 Biohazard. Eveline strikes again, and that really is no surprise to any of us, I think, because the fact of the matter is, Eveline is extremely horrifying and terrifying as a character, but as a boss fight, she has always left us disappointed. And that is never more the case than with Resident Evil 7's final boss, Eveline. In this encounter, it's actually very similar to the Birkin last form fight, where it pretty much focuses on the fact that Eveline takes over the entire battlefield and slowly moves towards you closer and closer and closer to the player, and the player is forced to unleash every bit of ammunition they have to defeat Eveline. So what makes this encounter different from Birkin? How is this encounter easier to beat than Birkin? Well, in my opinion, it comes down to one simple fact, and that is resources. Limited resources is a really big part of Resident Evil. However, when it comes to the Resident Evil 2 remake, when you go up against Final Birkin, at this point you had just finished fighting off against not only G3 Birkin, but also either Super Tyrant or G4 Birkin. So your ammunition is probably pretty low at this point. And like I mentioned earlier, if you run out of ammunition against Birkin, you now have to use your knife to fight back against him. And while Eveline also has an instant kill just like Birkin does, the fact of the matter is that you're more likely to have ammunition against Eveline in the final stage than you are against Birkin, in my opinion. So therefore, I personally find Eveline just a little bit easier than Birkin is. And sure, Eveline has a second phase, whereas Birkin's final form does not have a second phase. However, I feel like that's kind of voided because one, that second phase is even easier, in my opinion, than the first phase, and two, you are actually given a weapon to fight against the second phase, so the resources don't really matter at that point. But that's just my opinion. You guys let me know in the comments which of these encounters do you think is more difficult. I actually posted this as a poll question, and it seems like 70% of the community as of right now agrees with me, but I'd love to know your personal opinion. Which one do you find more difficult? Number 3, Stinger, the Giant Scorpion, Resident Evil 0. So if you thought the Giant Centipede was actually extremely easy as a boss fight, well, let me introduce you to one other boss fight in Resident Evil 0 that's even easier, and that is the Giant Scorpion. Whereas the Centipede actually runs around the entire map, and you can definitely take some damage if you get in its way, the Giant Scorpion actually, if done right, you won't take a single hit from this thing. Literally, all you have to do is load up your hunting rifle, aim down, and every time it gets close, shoot its head. Boom, just like that, the Scorpion will have a stagger effect, back up, and then repeat the process again. This thing doesn't really do anything crazy. Every now and then it might do like a body attack where it jumps forward and hits you, fine, whatever, but just get back on your feet, point back down, and continue the process. You do this and I guarantee you won't take a single hit of damage at all from this beast. The only thing that makes it a little bit more difficult than the other two that we're going to talk about in just a moment is that it actually can get to you if you make the mistake of not pulling the trigger at the right time. So I'll give it that.
Richard! Chris! Chris, stop! No!
Number 2, Neptune, Resident Evil and Resident Evil Remake. A giant shark might sound terrifying as a boss fight in Resident Evil, but honestly, it's probably one of the more easier encounters you can possibly have in the series against a boss. This shark may seem terrifying when you first encounter it inside the facility that is flooded with water, and it obviously has the advantage against you. However, once you exit through the door on the other side of the room and you manage to get to the place where you drain the entire facility of water, you are literally left with a fish out of water. The only reason why Neptune doesn't take spot number 1 on this list has to do with the fact that defeating him actually involves 3 different steps. Step 1, you have to run away from Neptune into a room on the other side of the area. However, you are running in water, so of course you move slowly, while Neptune obviously moves a lot faster than you, and he has his little buddies all around to assist him with, well, munching on you. However, if you manage to pass this first segment, which should be fairly easy unless you sit there shooting at the sharks like a dumbass, then you manage to get to the second part of the phase, and this is where things depend on if you're playing the remake or the original. The original is pretty much just a button that drains all the water in the area, so really doesn't have anything else to do. Neptune is pretty much, well, useless now and can't do a single thing in the original game. However, in the remake there are a couple additional steps that make him stand out a little bit more, and that is due to the fact that step 2 requires you to drain the water in a specific way and a specific order by following instructions, and failing to do so will result in Neptune pretty much killing you by busting open the glass. If you manage to pass this part, now you have to head down back to where Neptune is at, and you'll find that Neptune is now in a smaller body of water, not moving at all until you actually try to grab the key. He'll knock down the key into his little puddle of water, and if you forget to push that generator down and turn it on to electrocute him, then he will instant kill you. So yeah, he isn't that difficult of a boss, but if you miss any of these steps, it can easily result in you getting an instant kill if you're not careful. And that's the only reason why I didn't put him as number 1, despite him being probably one of the easiest bosses of the franchise. Number 1, Giant Alligator, Resident Evil 2, and Resident Evil 2 Remake. So what's really interesting is that Capcom loves taking animals in the real world and turning them into a bigger, more ferocious version of themselves and bring them as a boss in the Resident Evil franchise. However, a lot of times they don't really land it when it comes to the intimidation factor. Sure, the alligator is extremely intimidating. It is a terrifying creature, and it definitely scares the hell out of you when you first encounter it. And it is 100% one of the most iconic boss fights in the entire series. That being said, you have to admit one thing straight out of the gate, and that is the fact that the alligator is not all that difficult. Sure, in the Resident Evil 2 original game, I find it to be a little bit more difficult if you don't know exactly what to do, because you might end up finding yourself in a situation where you have to go guns blazing and keep backing up and shooting, backing up, shooting, backing up, shooting, backing up, shooting. However, most players would easily see that there is a button on the left hand side and that can be interacted with, and when the alligator gets close enough and you hit that button and it drops the gas canister and the alligator scoops that up, all it takes is one bullet to put that boss fight down once and for all. Even if you encounter this area in scenario B, this alligator will not be there because you just blew its head off. But now if you look at the remake of Resident Evil 2, you would see that it actually has been changed a lot actually. First off, only Leon encounters this alligator, and secondly, it's now like a quick time dodge minigame versus an actual boss fight. Whereas you have to see where the alligator is going to go next, you go the opposite direction, you dodge him. You do this a few times and eventually you will get to the point where the alligator grabs hold of some kind of pipe that is flammable. You take one bullet, shoot it into that flammable pipe, and boom, the alligator has been blown up yet again. Both encounters are extremely easy to pass as long as you pay attention. And ultimately, I feel like that this is the easiest boss in the entire series. Now, I'm basing this off of my personal experience. I'm basing this off of my first encounter with every single boss in the series. And my first encounter with the alligator, both times, yeah, I didn't have any issues at all. I didn't even come close to dying. So I have to put this at number 1 in my opinion. But I want to know what you guys think in the comments below. Let me know, which boss do you think is the easiest in the entire Resident Evil series? I know my list is crazy. It was really hard to build up this list because I had to think about my first encounter with every single boss in the entire series, and this was a difficult list, probably the most difficult list I had to make. So I want to get your opinions down below. Let me know which ones I missed and which ones am I crazy for even including on this list. Anyways, thanks for tuning in, guys, and I will see you on the next episode of Nerd Space Games. Take care.